And then there were none. Hey, everybody, it's Mike Schumann with the Daily Hoosier here for another episode of East 17th Street, along with Seth Tow. And Seth, it is Portal Madness season here on the IU men's side. There are literally none left as the entire roster has overturned. Not too terribly unexpected, but nevertheless still kind of shocking in the sense of, being a fan of a team or covering a team and just kind of watching this unfold and recognizing that when this team comes out on the floor next year, it's going to be a completely new cast of characters.
Yeah, I mean, it's like John Calipari said last year. I met with the team. There is no team. I mean, pretty much everybody's gone. From the men. I think Luke Goody. If he gets his waiver approved, he could be back. I mean, even that's not. There's not official word like yes, 100% lock it in. He is back
Right.
if approved. But you can connect those dots. But everybody else seems like is gone.
Yeah, it's a great point about Goody. I keep forgetting about him because he's such a wild card right now. I'm fascinated to see how that goes. The waiver request was filed, but it doesn't fit like what everybody says is the typical fact pattern that you got to have to get those approved. But I just have no idea in 2025 what that looks like in terms of what the NCAA is doing, how much teeth the NCAA has. Will there be like a lawsuit if it doesn't get approved? It's the wild west of college basketball extends to that sort of stuff right now as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million different. It seems like the rules are changing constantly with that. Like a million different cases that get pointed to in the past few years that have gone both directions that are somewhat similar to what Luke Goody is trying to do. But I mean, who really knows? I mean, we saw Lewis Moore from football enter the transfer portal and come back to IU when nobody thought he had eligibility left to begin with. So
Right.
who really knows?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I should also say that I've not heard, maybe you have, there's still Dallas James out there who has eligibility left because he didn't play this year. So he still technically has a redshirt season. I have no reason to believe he's coming back, but I guess he's another possibility that's still out there, at least on an unofficial basis. Nothing's been said. Have you heard anything about Dallas James?
No, I have not. But to be fair, I didn't hear anything on Dallas James during the season either.
That's a good way to put it. And I'll readily admit I've not been tracking that situation very closely. I have no expectation that he'll be back. We've seen this situation play out many times now, including Darren DeVries. I don't know when I'm going to get used to that because it's just not how you pronounce that spelling.
I'm going to say it 10 times fast.
That's even worse. Not going to do that. But, his roster last year, I think he had one player back. You saw Pat Kelsey at Louisville had nobody come back. I think Mark Pope had very limited returning guys at Kentucky last year. So it's almost just become kind of what you expect with a coaching change, both because of the portal and because, a new coach is going to want in and put their own stamp on the culture of the program, as DeVries said last week. So that's just kind of where we're at right now. And, I think, it's going to be fascinating to watch it all unfold, but at the same time, that's just where we're at in 2025 with roster construction.
Yeah, across college sports. I mean, even if it was Mike Woodson staying, you were probably going to see, I mean, obviously we've known what the situation was going to be with Woodson for a while, but even if Mike Woodson was back, you would have seen, maybe not to this extent, but you would have seen a lot of roster turnover from year to year anyway. I mean, just last year, I mean, it was, however many, 4 or 5, however many was guys they brought in from the portal, plus, whatever new freshmen you have coming in. And it's like, it feels like almost every year you're just going to have at least like half of your roster is just brand new. And so, there's the carryover development wise year to year from the men's team, particularly here, is just, it's gone. I mean, that's just the way the game is right now. We'll have to see where it goes, but that's just the way the game is right now.
Yeah, and the one thing I always gave Woodson credit for is he generally was able to keep the kind of the top end guys on his roster. Kind of almost seemed like there was some preening going on. Obviously a portal's a two-way street. Staffs can decide, hey, you might want to look somewhere else, and that stuff never really gets spoken publicly. But I will give Woodson some credit for that. He seemed to be able to keep the guys that he wanted to keep. But yeah, and I think what's really interesting is the upheaval is extending beyond even the team itself. We saw the announcement during the final home game of Larry Rink, the team physician, basically announcing his retirement. Today, there's news out that Tim Garl, the 45-year trainer, is not going to be back. So you're seeing, I literally don't know if there's going to be anybody that walks out of the tunnel for that first game in November that's going to be a familiar face from this year.
I mean, funny enough to think about, like the one guy who that might be is Trent Sisley, and he is still an incoming freshman.
Yeah, he's like kind of been a constant for 4 years because we've been covering him as a potential recruit. I coincidentally he'll be for people listening. We're recording this on Monday, March 31st. He'll be up in Fishers, Indiana this week for the Chipotle Nationals. If anybody wants to go watch Trent play, so there's an opportunity to see maybe the one face you'll recognize coming in. Another interesting aspect I want to touch on this because some guys, I think Louisville was one of the teams that got to take advantage of this, and DeVries last year at West Virginia is the potential for a summer trip for these guys. People will remember Woodson in his first year, ahead of his first year. Took the team to the Bahamas to play a couple games. But what is really interesting about that is if you do that, you get 10 extra practices. So it's almost like, you have to take advantage of something like that. So I think I should restate. You'll know the team by November because you'll get to watch them this summer whenever it all comes together. I don't think anybody knows yet where they're going to try to play or when. Hopefully somewhere somewhat affordable from a trip planning process. Family oriented would be good if anybody out there from IU is listening. But that's something to keep an eye on too. Obviously, we're talking about everybody leaving, but at the same time, there's a lot of buzz and noise about people coming too. Just this in the last couple of days, there's names like Ryan Conwell, the Xavier transfer, Josh Dix from Iowa. Indiana pretty much already knows they have Tucker DeVries coming in, obviously coach's son there. Mentioned Luke Goody, mentioned Trent Sisley. So things are already a little bit coming together. Obviously nobody knows about Conwell and Dix from how likely those are. I know both of them have several visits ongoing either last week or into this week. So that could be a while before we kind of start to see how that comes together. Have you paid much attention kind of on the timing point about this April 7th deadline? Hey, Ollie, how we doing, bud? For people not on YouTube watching, Seth's Chihuahua makes his regular appearance. Such a good guest. I don't think he's ever barked.
He rarely ever barks in general.
And I think of Chihuahuas as being like hyperactive and always yapping, but he knows he's well behaved. I think
he's not a yappy Chihuahua.
I think we need to up his NIL deal a little bit. But there's this notion out there that the NCAA is going to start effectuating some of the stuff from the major lawsuit, and part of that is that the NIL deals that guys or women obtain here for going forward are going to start being evaluated for, is it a fair market value deal? Is it actually a legitimate market value deal? And some are speculating that's going to be as soon as this weekend that would take effect. So if you have a signed NIL deal this week, it wouldn't be reviewed until I guess next year, or assuming it's a 1-year deal type situation. So the point being, there's some incentive to get some stuff done this week, and it'll be interesting if this is like just a crazy week across college basketball and even college football to some extent to get NIL deals done. Is that something you followed at all in terms of like the Alston case and the settlements that have all emanated from that?
Not super closely, really. I mean, I've seen the date thrown around, and obviously, like you say, it could be a crazy week, and it's
Oh,
interesting
just when
that
I was saying something good, Ollie. Come on.
like you say, it could be a crazy week, and I mean, it's especially notable that this is happening, and if the date is this weekend, I mean, the Final Four is also this weekend, so like the
Right.
season's not even over yet for some of the teams that are usually pretty active in the portal. I mean, at least when you look at like Duke and teams that have a lot of money to throw around, like their season may not even be over. So when you look at the women's side too, so it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how it's going to impact things going forward, and I think there is probably a double-edged sword of you know there's the incentive to get maybe get some business done this week, but you also don't want to rush into decisions with that date in mind, and
Right.
bring in the players, bring in people as quickly as possible, but then end up with the wrong people.
Right. Yeah, I kind of feel like I feel like that date's being overdone a little bit. I don't think anybody at this point in time is going to go out of their way to sign some egregious deal that could still somehow get looked at down the road. I mean, it's probably not a bad idea to get stuff done this week, just in light of what's coming. But I'm not sure anybody's going to rush to make sure they get it in, unless it's more driven from the player or agent side. I don't think schools are going to necessarily be too hyper focused on it, but I could be wrong about that. Were any of the players that left Indiana, I'm saying left in quotes because I guess they could technically come back. Were any of them surprising to you? I know we talked about this, and I said I wouldn't be surprised if they all left. And I the more I thought about it, I thought DeVries might try to keep a guy like Miles Rice just because he brings some really unique and elite things to the floor with his speed and his ability to change the game that way. But I can't really say any of those guys really surprised me at the end of the day. Not to mention the fact that it's not just a one-way street, as I mentioned. DeVries can choose not to have them back, but they can choose to go in the portal as well.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, none of it really surprises me. I mean, DeVries could still, you say Miles Rice, like DeVries could, Miles Rice hasn't committed somewhere, like
Right.
DeVries could still bring him back, but when you have a big major coaching change like this, I mean, nobody can really blame any of the men's basketball players for entering the transfer portal right now,
Right.
because they didn't come here knowing that they were going to be playing for Darren DeVries. They came here to play for Mike Woodson, and that whole situation just completely upended. That it may not say anything about it. It might not say anything about how they feel about the program as a whole, the university as a whole, just the whole Indiana basketball infrastructure. That it may or may not say anything about that they go into the portal. But I mean, DeVries could still be pitching them, but if unless they feel so strongly about positively about Indiana basketball as a the infrastructure, just the program beyond the coach that they're playing for, that they want to give it would basically be like giving a free agent in a professional league giving exclusive negotiating rights to a certain team. And
Right.
what you may as well at that point just kind of open it up, and that doesn't say DeVries can't pitch these players, but see what else is out there. Nobody can really blame these players for doing that. So none of it really surprised me.
Yeah, I like the way you put that about exclusive rights. I've thought about it like if I had a kid in that situation, I would probably tell them, put your name in the portal, see what comes of it, unless you absolutely love it at IU, irrespective of the coach. I mean, speaking of Sicily, I think going back to his commitment to when Woodson was there, I think that was in irrespective of who the coach is type of commitment. But those are rare. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're unless it's an in-state kid that grew up a fan of a local team, I don't think you're gonna see very much of that. And it's just a reality that we all have to accept and wrap our arms around right now. Is that it's not just that these guys can get money. They are, in so many ways, professional athletes in terms of, needing to owe it to themselves to find out what their market rate is. And in a lot of cases, maximize the opportunity because this might be the most they ever make in their lives,
Right.
literally. So it would be hard to blame anybody in this scenario for going into the portal. So it's obviously just going to be a fascinating few weeks here as we see everybody leave, and then at some point, end up with 13, I guess even 15 players if they choose to go that route. There's also at the same time the entire coaching staff appears to be flipping. I'm not aware of anybody expected to be back from Indiana's actual assistant coaches. I had heard some early on that Brian Walsh was maybe a possibility to come back, but I'm not currently expecting that. I don't know for sure who is coming in. I think, well, I shouldn't say that. Indiana hasn't confirmed it, but if you were paying attention on Saturday evening at the Indiana State Finals, uh, DeVries was there with Nick Norton, his assistant from West Virginia, assistant at Drake, former player at Drake, longtime connection there between those two. And Norton was wearing Indiana gear, so that's as clear as you can get that he's expected to come. And it was also interesting. DeVries was interacting a lot, at times sitting next to Drew Adams, current Cincinnati assistant, a guy with very heavy IU connections. But Adams didn't have on any Cincinnati gear. I thought that was interesting. Like everybody there, that was a coach of a team had on the gear of their team. Adams came neutral, which may be a good indicator that things are fluid there at the moment. But he's, as I understand it, he is somebody that DeVries tried to hire a year ago when he got the job at West Virginia. Got turned down at that time, but Indiana's a different situation for Adams, who's a Bloomington native, went to South High School, spent some time on the IU staff, played for Steve Alford at Iowa. There's a lot of connections there that would make him make a lot of sense. Also, his dad runs or co-runs Indiana Elite, the Adidas AAU program. So there's a lot of potential there in terms of attracting talent. I think getting in deep with Indiana Elite is a priority of DeVries, as I understand it, and I think there's already been some meetings there with the leadership of that organization. So Adams would make a lot of sense if he's willing to make the switch. So that he's definitely somebody to keep an eye on down the road. Any other thoughts from you in terms of coaching staff and kind of how they should construct the staff, or you see people go like geographic, or guys that are more thought of as recruiting specialists. I hear names thrown out, but big picture thoughts of if it is Adams and Norton, like maybe where else they need to go.
Honestly, I'm not really sure. I mean, who knows about Adams showing up neutral is certainly interesting, but
Yeah.
it could also just indicate that he showed up on laundry day. But I mean, I think obviously the recruiting angle is important, but it's also, I think, in general, you need people. I've said this for a while. Like I think when the connections to IU and the connections to the past should probably be near the bottom of the priority list. I think you need to not to dissociate yourself with the past of the program,
Right.
but you don't need to force those people onto the bench, into the coaching staff. Like just bring in the best people for the job, regardless of their background, regardless of their you want people that are familiar with recruiting the state of Indiana, but you want people that are familiar with Illinois and Kentucky and Florida and California. You just want people that are going to help bring in the best players, and you need people that are fluent with the transfer portal and NIL, and obviously where everything is going with that. And just you need a staff in place that's going to be able to help you bring this program into the next era of what college basketball is going to look like post house settlement. I mean, that's
Right.
DeVries is obviously, the point man, and that was, part of what he said, during his introductory press conference, that, it's his job to, figure out what the future of the program looks like, not just, keeping it in the past, but, he needs people around him that are going to help him do that.
I would agree 100%. Any other thoughts on IU basketball or men's basketball before we pivot over to the women's side?
Yeah. This came to me when we were talking to, as far as like incoming names. I think there could be something to the fact that obviously, I don't think there's been any official report or confirmation besides like it's highly expected that Tucker DeVries is going to be
Right.
at IU next year. And I think there's probably, for all the talk of, oh, everybody's gone and, there's nothing left on the roster. Like the fact that Tucker DeVries is like very likely, you can pencil him into the roster at this point. I would use ink, but you could pencil him into the roster for next year. The fact that he's there could give some comfort level to transfers that are looking at this program that, may not have been there if the roster was completely empty. Like, that Tucker DeVries is going to be there. You may not have to come in and you don't have to be, nobody that comes in is going to be the first. Like, you don't have
Right.
to be like the first guy to just kind of take a chance on an empty roster. Tucker DeVries is already there. And I mean, already a very good player, 2-time MVC player of the year. So you're not coming in with completely nothing. Like, you have somebody who's proven himself at the college level who's already there. And, for all the talk of empty roster, just complete rebuild, like that's probably not something to overlook. The fact that, any transfers considering Indiana, there is a good player already on basically here.
Yeah, and if people don't know, my understanding is he's in the same situation as Goody, just with better facts. So that might be why there's been no announcement as it relates to him, because nothing's official from the NCAA, and he does need a waiver to play. I mentioned Conwell and Dix. If you think about a lineup that included Tucker DeVries, Ryan Conwell, and Josh Dix, I mean that's a complete change in terms of what we've seen from IU basketball truly over the last decade or more. Again, no reason to believe that Conwell and Dix are any more likely to go to IU than anywhere else, but the potential out there to not only change the roster but to change the identity and playing style, and ultimately the results are there. Other names, I believe Connor Enright, point guard from DePaul, is visiting tomorrow. Again, we're recording on March 31st. He's expected on April 1st. Another guy that played for DeVries at Drake. Floyd Badunga's name is out there, and it's got a connection to Drew Adams, because Flory came up through Indiana Elite, and I believe even the Adams family, Adams family, not that Adams family, Drew Adams family, his father Mark runs Indiana Elite, as I mentioned. I think they played a role in bringing Flory from Africa over to the U.S. So I think there's a pretty deep connection there that could be interesting. So we'll see how that plays out. There hasn't been a whole lot of other names, and probably some of that is because DeVries has been so focused on just getting his staff put together so that they can start going full bore on some of these pursuits. But that's what I've got so far in terms of guys that are either visiting or appear likely to visit at this point. And what's always interesting to me is, like, say Indiana did straight gold here and got like a DeVries, Conwell, and Dix and Badunga, just a crazy looking roster. It's the rest of the roster that's really fascinating to me. When you're trying to rebuild from nothing, you don't have those freshmen coming up, you don't have any infrastructure in place, but you gotta get 12, 13 guys. Like, what kind of players do you get that know coming in out of the portal that they're going to probably be reserves? That will be interesting to watch, and I think it's something that maybe Indiana struggled with a little bit under Woodson, was kind of filling out the back half of the roster. Like, once kind of roles were pretty well known and identified by the initial guys that they brought in through the portal. Obviously people aren't in the transfer portal to go be a backup somewhere else. So that's going to be something interesting to watch in the weeks to come as well.
Yeah, I was going to make that last point there, just kind of out of fairness to IU, because, like you say, people that go into the transfer portal are usually looking for more playing time. Obviously, there's a number of reasons you could go into the transfer portal, but people that go into the transfer portal typically are not looking to get less minutes. And
Right.
it's just that's a real challenge if you're going into the portal to get just kind of a depth piece. Like, so obviously you need somebody that has that mindset, that's willing to take a back seat, and that's really tough. Just to find that in the transfer portal, it's a lot easier to kind of have that, say like Trent Sisley, whether this year or next year, depending on his development or whatever. Like, that when you have a freshman come in and you kind of develop him into the point of okay, now he's like year one he's not playing, year two he's a role player. When you kind of naturally move up that progression from the start at a program, that's a lot different than when you're bringing in a transfer who is coming in getting whatever NIL money he's going to get, but he wants a role right away. And so it's just tough to find those pieces. And that is going to be interesting to see how DeVries approaches that, and maybe that just kind of comes down to whether he has some guys from West Virginia that end up going into the portal that, want to follow him. If he had guys in those sorts of roles already on his roster, West Virginia, or even going back to Drake, like just, guys that he had further connections with. Maybe it's, players that he, tried to recruit at West Virginia or Drake and ended up, committing elsewhere, but now we're in the portal and, things kind of work out kind of like how Malik Renew wound up with Mike White in the end anyway. Like,
right.
Just those past connections, even if they didn't work out the first time, those are the types of names I would say you probably want to keep an eye on just for those reserve roles, because if there's no other connection to DeVries or Indiana, it's, why else would a random guy want to come in somewhere and play less than he already was?
Right. And that's a good point about prior connections DeVries has, because the reason, or at least one of the reasons why they're getting some traction with Josh Dix is because Josh Dix was an AAU teammate of Tucker DeVries and somebody that Darren DeVries recruited heavily when he was in college, when DeVries was at Drake, and Dix is Iowa product as well. So clearly you're right about that. Those kind of connections from prior situations are being leveraged as well. And I'd be remiss on this point to not mention that, West Virginia had 3 high school commits, a top 25-ish class that haven't really gotten a lot of mention, but could be, a key part of the answer in terms of kind of filling out the back part of that roster. Kelvin Odie or Odie, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, was probably the headliner of the group. But you also have Trent McLean, Braden Hawthorne as the 3 in that class. The latter, Hawthorne, has been described as somebody that's pretty well connected with Chester Frazier, who was an assistant with DeVries, and it's not clear what his next move is going to be. So if he doesn't come to IU, it may impact whether or not Hawthorne would come to IU. But those would be guys to keep an eye on, as well as Desmond Briscoe, who's an in-state product at Crispus Attucks that played in the state finals in front of DeVries on Saturday night. Former Iowa commit that's uncommitted at the moment after the Fran McCaffrey change there at Iowa. So he could be somebody that, could be viewed as like a longer term type situation that they could develop over time and kind of fit that need on the roster that we're talking about here. So before we go over to the women's side, I want to segue with just kind of the state of college basketball, because I was thinking about this today. Like I mentioned, or we talked about earlier, on the situation with the men is kind of expected with the coaching change. But what's going on with IU women's basketball is really interesting to me right now. And you had a good post on X earlier, just, listing out the players that are coming back right now. I think it's 7 players from this past year's team, and only one that was really a major contributor. With
2 from that list were incoming freshmen, actually. So
yeah,
it's even it's like I think they had 13 players on scholarship for next season, in counting the 2 incoming freshmen entering entering the off season, and they are now down to 7. So that would mean they only had 5 players from this past season's roster who are set to return.
Yeah, and that's happening in the what I would almost characterize as the opposite situation, where you have a coach that's doing a fantastic job, as brought this program to heights never previously seen, and still you're seeing that sort of roster fluctuation, and it just makes me think, like, is this a sustainable model for the fans from the standpoint of just constantly dealing with this overhaul of a roster every year, never really connecting with players. I mean, maybe I'm dramatizing it a bit, but when you see it happen in a situation like Indiana women's basketball, after how good the program has been, it does make you wonder. Like, we've been hearing for a few years now about there needs to be collective bargaining, or there needs to be some sort of federal solution to all this. I think if you're the schools, the NCAA, you got to be concerned that, this ultimately isn't something that's, optimal from a fan's perspective. And if the fans disengage, then the money goes with it. So, what are your thoughts on that? Am I making too much of it, or, do you feel like it's a legitimate concern? Obviously, we're just in a major state of fluctuation right now.
I mean, of course, I don't think this is sustainable, from
Yeah,
any aspect. I don't think you're over dramatizing anything. I mean, you don't see this in any sports league, in any sort of league in the world for anything, where pretty much at the end of every season, everybody could be a free agent. And that's not good for anybody.
right,
And like you say, it's tough for player development. And it's tough for player development if you have people that are going to come in, change programs, coaches every year, because being a college student, being a student athlete is hard enough, and there's all the adjusting to your new location and your new setting and your new environment and your teammates and everything. Like, if you're doing that 2 or 3 times in a college career, like, that's hard. And that's going to stunt a player's ability to kind of develop, from whatever they came in from high school with. But from the fan aspect too, it's just hard for fans are gonna, I mean, obviously, you have fans of players that are going to root for some players, regardless. Like, it's probably rarer to get those types of stars in the college game, but the person that comes to mind is like Caitlin Clark. Like, if Caitlin Clark had for some reason transferred from Iowa to UConn, like,
right,
all of her giant fan base would have just flipped to UConn.
right,
But for the most part, college sports fans are kind of rooting for the name on the front of the jersey,
right,
not the name on the back, to borrow the cliche. So that does make it difficult when people in the front of the jersey are changing every single year. You don't have, there's just so little carryover. And I mean, when you look at IU women, the women's basketball team, like Terry Morin had talked about it, when talking about Chloe Moore McNeil, who just graduated, the Chloe Moore McNeils are rare these
right.
days, where you have somebody who stuck with just stuck with the same program for 5 years. I mean, even on the men's side, I mean, I heard people saying similar things about Julian Reese at Maryland. That, I mean, Julian Reese's are rare. Just the people that stick with a program for 4 or 5 years, maybe, in Reese's case, through multiple coaches, and just, keep your development all at, in one place, and wait your turn maybe to get a big role in Chloe's case. And, you just kind of wait it out, take the traditional college athletics path. That's rare. You don't really see that much anymore. And I mean, no one is going to say, that, transfer, you're getting into a whole real deep rabbit hole here. If we're
Yeah,
really going down this conversation path, kids should be able to transfer, because coaches are also able to transfer,
yep,
freely. But it's just, there's no both with coaches and with players. I mean, you can point to, how Kevin Willard just handled everything with Maryland is, an equally, grotesque, an equally
right,
bad example of all of this on the coach's side. But it's like, it's just the wild, wild west with everything. And the only way to really stop this, in my mind, is for some sort of, because the NCAA just has seemingly lost all of its ability to govern over its athletic,
yes,
over its sports. And you have no, you need like a commissioner of some sort, or a commissioning body that is making decisions in the best interest of the game and the best interest of college sports, because the people that are consistently making the decisions for everything are just looking out for themselves, or looking out for the money only, or just
right,
looking out for their universities only. And you're never going to get anywhere like that, because everybody's just going to look out for themselves if that's all they have to worry about. You need somebody that, you know, if you're good, people can float out, oh, this would help. Like I saw Jeff Goodman post something today about, there should be like transfer fees. Like, if like say IU takes some player from High Point, like Indiana should have to pay High Point a fee, so that High Point, is not completely, hurt by that. But that sort of thing would never get implemented if there's not like a commissioner that's looking out for the good of the game. If everybody's looking out for themselves, then the little guys are going to get left behind.
Yeah, and it also I don't think would work unless you had some sort of legally binding structure holding it all together. Because as we've seen, anytime the NCAA tries to do anything now, people are suing, and that's where collective bargaining comes in. Is you got to have something happen that everybody can agree. Okay, we've agreed to this. It's legally binding. There's not going to be any lawsuits because of it. And until that happens, we're going to keep seeing this. Do you think it's even more pronounced on the women's side? I haven't been tracking numbers, men's versus women's, but I was thinking about this earlier when the Yarden Garzone news came out. I mentioned earlier that as a male student athlete in college basketball, you're thinking like this might be the best year you ever have in terms of making money. I think on the women's side, it's probably even more pronounced because the international side of basketball, playing professionally, is not as developed. There's not as many opportunities in the WNBA, and there's not as much NIL money in college. So if you're somebody like Garzone sitting there, I don't. Maybe why she's leaving or testing the waters. I don't, but she's got real market value right now, and in her case, I'm sure she'll play internationally somewhere, if not the WNBA. But this is a chance, once in a lifetime chance for her as well. And I think on the women's side in general, I think that's probably much more of a consideration because the dollars just aren't there.
Yeah, and when you're looking at the women's game in general, I mean, especially with NIL opportunities, I don't know the exact numbers, but there are numbers out there that, like, in terms of social media followings, like women's basketball players have some of the top, are exceeding like Juju Watkins. I think, I don't know if she's the top, or Paige Beckers, or whoever it is, but the top line of like the women's basketball players are getting significantly more of the social media following than the men's players are, men's basketball or football or whatever it is. So, the NIL money, at least for that top group of athletes, might be even bigger. And, and that might be less of, whatever they're getting from their collectives and more from what NIL was originally intended to be. But, again, we're getting into a whole nother conversation there.
Yeah. I mean, not to get into it, but that's been my contention from the jump, is that you got to come up with a way to make these deals actual arm's length, fair market deals, and not just who's got the richest boosters willing to pay the most money. I mean, I gotta believe at some point rich boosters would get tired of wasting money on this, but with no like reasonable expectation of a return, or no guarantees, or nothing about it being arm's length. But hopefully that commission that we talked about, that I think it's Deloitte is the firm that is supposed to be enforcing all these NIL deals and actually examining them and saying, okay, that a market value deal or not. Hopefully that kind of does bring some balance to all this. I have no idea if it will, but I think that's at least something that I'm optimistic about as I look forward. But focusing now in on IU women's basketball, we talked about the upheaval in its entirety. Kind of give me your big picture reaction to what's going on there. If you think there's any underlying stories, or what's your kind of just your thoughts about what's going on?
Yeah, well, okay. I guess the Yarden Garzone, I'm going to separate the Yarden Garzone transfer, because her exit, I think, is, to start off, I don't have anything concrete on why that happened. I've been getting radio silence or I don't knows. And, there's been theories out there. And I think it is important to note also with her, somebody made this point to me on Twitter earlier. And then about, because keep in mind, she is an international student, and their whole situation with NIL is different than than American citizens. And I actually asked, I have a good friend named Josh Freezer, who's specializes in NIL law. And I was asking him about this just to kind of make it right. And make sure I have the info right. And basically, I mean, there's no NCAA rule against, international. It's not the NCAA. You're just kind of putting yourself at risk of, your visa getting revoked or, not renewed. If, you're basically, somebody like Yarden would be on a student visa and like, you're not permitted to be working, you're not supposed to be earning money, when you're on a student visa. You're here as a student. You're not here, as an employee. And, say that Yarden was going to, play in the WNBA, she would have to kind of get a different, then get a work visa. And so I think there's just the risk of that happening. And certainly, not diving into politics at all, but when you look at what's happening with the current administration and what they've been doing immigration wise, obviously, maybe that risk is of something happening if you run afoul of any visa laws. Like, certainly maybe that risk could be a little more heightened right now, that something could happen. So that's not to say that NIL isn't a factor. It may well be a factor. But it's just, that's something to keep in mind, that, she's probably having to be a little careful, at least, about, the NIL aspect of everything. That said, back to, I guess, where I was originally going to go with this. Separating Garzone from everything, when you look at the other players, the five other players who went into the portal, nothing was super surprising to me in that group. I mean, I think maybe it was probably a shock for Indiana fans that follow this program to see that many names leaving.
Right.
But I mean, Lily Meister got benched this season because she was flat out underperforming. And not that she doesn't have potential and not that she can't, be better, but like, she was underperforming and got benched for Caroline Strickland. And it's not like she handled it particularly well. I mean, she struggled for weeks after that. And, yes, she came back and gave them some important minutes in the postseason. But I mean, Indiana could not reasonably go into next season feeling comfortable penciling Meister in as the starting five. And that's, the reason that Indiana women have been as successful as they've been and, operated the way they have the last bunch of years without a lot of, this level of movement, is because they've developed talent. They've had talent that's stuck around, into their fifth, 6 years, whatever, like Mackenzie Holmes, Grace Berger, staying around for long periods of time. That obviously helps and can mask some sort of issues, but they also were developing players behind them or bringing in the couple of supplementary pieces, around them to step into those next roles, when, those players leave. And they've now hit somewhat of a development wall, I think it's fair to say, with some of these classes of players where they're losing 3 starters, they're, to graduation, in Chloe Moore McNeil, Sydney Parrish, and Caroline Strickland, but you don't have those pieces ready to step in immediately to fill both those roles, the starting roles, because I don't think you could really feel you could make it work with Lexus Bargesser as your starting one. But I think if you were going to do that, you'd already need to be in the portal, bringing in a more offensively focused guard.
Right.
And at that point, I would be asking myself, why am I not just starting that player over Bargesser anyway? And then, so, you could do that, but like, just there, you don't have those players to step into those starting roles. And then those abandoned reserve roles. I mean, I don't think you could really rely on Hannah Sandvik for much, as far as a reserve, more than the 10 minutes a game that she played this year. Jules Lamandola showed promise, at times, but I think there's probably a reason why she didn't get more playing time than she did, 10 minutes a game, whatever it was, because her build is there. Lamandola is like the ideal kind of prototype build wise of what I feel like Terry Morin looks for in a player, kind of a bigger wing that, can play inside or outside, can in theory shoot, but just it never really all came together for her. And so I mean, certainly can't blame them if, for going and maybe going elsewhere if they don't think they're going to get the playing time they need. But I also don't necessarily think that, I don't know that Terry Morin I'm not saying she's not sad to leave them, to see them go, relationships wise or anything. But
Right.
I think we were getting to a point this coming off season where Indiana women needed to really, really rebuild their roster in terms of not just the names on the roster, but just in terms of how this team wants to play basketball and the attributes that these players have. And I think in some ways, I said this in one of the stories I wrote last week, that I thought this team had more, when they had 13 players on scholarship and, including the incoming freshmen, when they had the 13 players on scholarship for next season going before any of the portal moves, they had 2 available scholarships because you get 15. I thought they had more than 2 needs they were going to need to address in the transfer portal. So some of these players, they were going to have some level of outbound movement just to get the number of spots open that they need. And you have to remember also that Terry Morin has rarely ever used all 15
Right.
scholarships because she's not the type to see much value in that 15th player being there. She plays a pretty thin rotation to begin with often. So, she's not, I don't know how many players they're going to bring in, what it's going to look like. But those 5 players that all left, it was not a huge surprise to me necessarily, because I think a lot of those players are going to be better suited elsewhere, maybe starting for a mid-major or, and maybe in Alamandola's case, just kind of trying a different high major, maybe closer to home. Who knows? Just, a fresh start for somebody like that might not be a bad idea. Garzone is interesting because this is the team's leading scorer, an international student, from Israel, who clearly loves Indiana. I mean, you saw on social media, she'd be dunking on Purdue on social media. Like
Right.
I mean, there, with everything that's been going on, in her homeland the last few years in Israel, I mean, there's a, very strong Jewish community at IU, and she was seemingly very well supported as all of this
Right.
was going on. So it's very interesting to me that she's also left. And, there's rumors. Like I said, I have not gotten anything concrete on why this has happened. So I can't offer a sure thing necessarily. Maybe I'll get that sort of sure thing, later on. But, there's rumors that it could be NIL related, that maybe it's, when you think about where the position Yarden was sitting in, also that, she already was going to be the leading scorer for, coming back, but she just saw all, Sydney Parrish, Chloe Moore McNeil, Caroline Strickland all leave. And all the players that she came up with that, Hannah Sandvik, Lexus Bargesser, Lily Meister, all those other players in her class all also left,
Right.
to go to the portal. And, she might just kind of be looking around thinking that, it's just not the same Indiana that she came to love. And, maybe just seeing all of her friends go into the portal, made her kind of wonder if she should stick around too. And I mean, that's, less basketball oriented than it is just, human being, be wanting to be with her friend, and that maybe where she ends up and who's around her will give some insight as far as that goes. But, that could be part of it. I don't really, it's very interesting. And now, I mean, who knows if they're done, I mean, it would be surprising, if there's really a lot more to come, because there's just not many players that could still leave. But
Right.
Terry Morin has work to do. But the other interesting thing with Yarden is, I mean, maybe unintentionally, I actually noted it seemed like Terry Morin may have talked about her with using some past tense at times later in the season, like, instead of saying she's great to, she's so coachable, she's great to coach, she's a really good player, she would say things like, I've had a great time coaching her, it's, she was a great player for us. Or that might just be something unintentional, but
Right.
that at least kind of struck me as like, huh. And I mean, you also look at how this season went for Yarden. Obviously, she was the leading scorer, like I keep saying, great shooter, great player. But I mean, she did get benched for the late in a few games just because she either was playing poorly, and I think her athleticism was a constant source of
Right.
frustration. Just that defensively, she could be a liability if she wasn't knocking down shots. And for Terry Morin has said after the season ended that they need to get more athletic, and that's something this team has needed to do for a long time. I can't imagine that that's something where Indiana said, okay, we need you to go. We need to get more athletic.
No.
There's no way that happened. But it is an opportunity potentially to rebuild a roster that is more athletic and is able to kind of get up and down the floor quicker and defend more of those quicker players that you see on some Big Ten teams, on certainly teams like South Carolina, like just to maybe it might be an opportunity. And that's kind of the glass half full take versus the glass
Sure.
half empty take is, maybe it is an opportunity to kind of really build Indiana into a more athletically built team. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But that's, I think, how I would separate it. Like, I was not really surprised by any of the 5 names who left before. I mean, Garzone, I had heard rumors that might be happening, so it wasn't waking up at 8:30 in the morning with my jaw dropped to the floor. But I mean, in a big picture sense, that is surprising.
Yeah, it's still surprising when you see it, even if we were kind of expecting it, or at least had heard those rumors. I'm with you on the other 5. Like, if I were advising any of them, I'd say, unless you just need a change of scenery, but want to try to stay high major. To me, they all seem like players that could go mid major and probably be really good players. If that's what's important to them, is to make sure that in their final year or years of eligibility that they're going to get a lot of minutes and have a lot of opportunities. That seems like the way to go for them. From the IU side, I think it's going to be real interesting. I view Terry Morin, you may disagree with this, like just listening to her press conferences, like she kind of strikes me as the old school type that really, probably isn't too thrilled or enamored about any of this stuff, portal, NIL, any of it. I'm sure she's fine with the players getting paid, but actually having to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. That being said, she's in a position right now, like you said, of rebuilding the roster. And, I think pretty much everybody that follows the team noticed that they were athletically deficient, among other things. I think from a system, a scheme, a culture, I think the program's fantastic. I think they run great stuff on offense. They play great defense. But they if they want to compete at that next level, they clearly have to be more athletic. So it's just another situation, great for us who do this for a living to always have good content and always have something to do. Is that, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch what she does, because she's in a position now, like you said, where she can, really go out there and try to bring in players that she recognizes are necessary to take the next step, or at least maybe not even, that's not even the right way to say it, to get back to where they were over the last few years, and maybe even change the way that they get there via a more athletic team.
Yeah. And I mean, look, Terry is not somebody who's anti-transfer by any
Right.
means. Even before the transfer portal was a thing, I mean, Ali Patberg herself was a transfer from Notre
Right.
Dame. And, that was, back in the era where you had to sit a year after you transfer. So, I mean, she's never been afraid to go bring in transfers from other programs. And, obviously, you could Sydney Parrish, Sarah Scalia, both transfers. Shea Chesky, who's now the best player on the team remaining, transfer from Penn State. Caroline Strickland turned out to be a pretty good addition from the transfer portal this year. So she's not afraid to go into to bring in transfers necessarily. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch. Even before all of this, happened, I don't know that it was a stretch but certainly now that it has all happened, it's not a stretch to say that this is the most important offseason of Terry Morin's era at Indiana.
Yeah, I feel like every other year there's been, several players coming back that you could point to and say, yeah, I can see them continuing to be strong because of who they have coming back right now. I can't see it at all. But, I guess to segue into that, I've seen, just based on social media stuff, the center at Penn State.
Mhm.
Her name's escaping me, but I do remember her being.
Gracie Merkel.
Yeah, she was very effective in the game against Indiana.
Mhm.
They had a hard time stopping her, and seemed like a really key cog for somebody to pick up out of the portal. Apparently, she's already visited. Is that right, or is that?
Yeah.
I think that's what I saw. And then there's a guard from Arkansas that was there this
Mhm.
weekend. Have you heard any other names connected with Indiana at this point?
I have not yet, but I also there's less reporting out there,
Right.
in
Yeah.
general, with all of that, but um it's rapidly developing too. I mean, team seasons that just end,
Right.
could have players going to the portal and all of that, still. So it's all rapidly developing. I'm obviously keeping an eye on it, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's they've done a pretty good job in the past of keeping things pretty much under wraps, and it seems like unless
Mhm.
a player like posts their visit on Instagram or something, it pretty well stays pretty low key. So I think that'll be one just here again, like the men here over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're gonna, it's gonna be a transfer palooza, incoming instead
Yeah.
of outgoing.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, anything else you want to talk about, or should we call it right there? We're coming up on an hour, which always seems like a good point to to cut it off.
No, I think people have listened to me talk for long enough. If you stuck it out to this point.
Well, we'll obviously have much more coverage as players start to come in the door here over the next couple of weeks, but we will cut it off for there this time. He is Seth Tow. I am Mike Schumann for East 17th Street. We will catch you all next time.